On a quiet street in the small town of Millbrook, Harold Thompson's white two-story house stood as a testament to time. The 93-year-old World War II veteran had lived there for over 50 years, and everyone in the neighborhood knew him as the kind old man with the most beautiful rose garden in town. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and wrinkles, still maintained the strength to tend to his beloved flowers every morning. Each day followed the same peaceful routine that Harold had perfected over the years. He would wake up at exactly 6:30 a.m., just as he had done during his military service, though those days were long behind him now. The morning sun would find him in his neatly pressed khaki pants and a clean white shirt, his silver hair carefully combed, as he made his way down the creaking stairs of his home. The first order of business was always his roses. Harold had planted them decades ago with his late wife, Martha, and taking care of them helped him feel connected to her memory. There were 37 rose bushes in total, each one carefully labeled with its variety name on a small wooden stake. The neighbors often saw him talking softly to the flowers as he pruned and watered them, his movements slow but precise. After tending to his garden, Harold would take his daily walk to Betty's Diner, 3 blocks away. The walk took him exactly 17 minutes, as he used his polished wooden cane more for balance than support. The regulars at the diner always saved his favorite spot, the third booth from the door, where he could see both the street and the kitchen. Betty herself, though she was now in her 60s, still called him Mr. Thompson and knew his order by heart. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast with a pat of butter, and black coffee in his personal mug that stayed at the diner. The peaceful rhythm of Harold's life had remained unchanged for years. His home at the end of Oak Street was a quiet haven where he spent his afternoons reading military history books or writing letters to his grandson who was stationed overseas. Sometimes he would sit in his wooden rocking chair on the front porch, watching the neighborhood children play and offering them hard candies he always kept in his pocket. But everything changed on a warm Tuesday in May when Harold noticed unusual activity in the vacant building across from his house. The old Wilson's hardware store, which had been empty for the past 3 years, was suddenly buzzing with activity. Men in leather vests were moving furniture and equipment inside, and a large sign was being installed above the door. Harold watched from his garden, his pruning shears paused mid-cut, as the sign was unveiled. Iron Knights MC Clubhouse. The letters were bold and black, with a fierce-looking knight's helmet as the logo. Throughout the day, more and more motorcycles began parking outside the building, their chrome fixtures gleaming in the sun. That night, for the first time in years, Harold couldn't enjoy his evening routine of watching the sunset from his porch. The rumble of motorcycles and loud music from the clubhouse drowned out the cheerful chirping of the cardinals he usually fed. The peaceful atmosphere of Oak Street was shattered by bursts of laughter and the constant revving of engines. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling fan slowly rotating above him, Harold felt a deep unease settling in his stomach. The framed photographs on his bedroom wall seemed to watch him with concern, images of a younger Harold in his military uniform, standing proud with his unit, medals gleaming on his chest. Among them was his favorite picture, he and Martha on their wedding day, both beaming with hope for their future on Oak Street. The sound of another motorcycle roaring past his house made his windows rattle slightly. Harold turned on his bedside lamp and picked up the silver-framed photograph of Martha from his nightstand. "Well, my dear," he whispered to her image, "it seems our quiet little street is about to change." He didn't know then just how right he was, or how this disruption would lead to one of the most challenging situations he'd faced since his military days. The changes on Oak Street happened faster than Harold could have imagined. Within just 2 weeks of the Iron Knights moving in, the peaceful neighborhood had transformed completely. The motorcycle club members seemed to have no respect for the quiet life that once existed there, especially when it came to the elderly veteran across the street. It started with small things. Harold would find empty beer cans in his rose garden every morning, crushed and scattered among his precious flowers. The younger bikers would rev their engines extra loud whenever they saw him working in his yard, laughing when he winced at the sudden noise. Some even made it a game, seeing who could make the loudest sound as they passed his house. One particular group of 3 bikers, whom Harold had mentally nicknamed the Troublemakers, seemed to take special pleasure in bothering him. They were always wearing black leather vests with patches he couldn't quite read, and their motorcycles were the loudest of all. The leader, a tall man with a snake tattoo on his neck, would often park his bike right in front of Harold's house, despite there being plenty of space near their clubhouse. Harold tried to handle the situation properly. First, he went to speak with the club's leadership one morning. He put on his best shirt, picked up his cane, and walked across the street. But before he could even reach the clubhouse door, the troublemakers intercepted him. Well, look who's come to visit, the snake-tattooed leader sneered, blocking Harold's path. What's wrong, old-timer? Not enough excitement in your life? Harold stood straight, just as he had done when facing challenges in the war. I'd like to speak with your club president about the noise levels and the trash in my garden, he said firmly, his voice not showing any fear. The bikers just laughed. Welcome to the new Oak Street, Grandpa, one of them said, pretending to rev an invisible motorcycle handle. Better get used to it. That afternoon, Harold called the police. Officer Jenny Martinez, who had known him for years, came to take his complaint. She walked around his property, taking notes and photos of the scattered trash, but her expression wasn't hopeful. I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, she said gently, but the noise levels are technically within legal limits during daytime hours. And unless we catch someone in the act of littering, there's not much we can do. Have you considered installing security cameras? Harold's neighbors watched all this from behind their curtains. Mrs. Anderson from next door brought him a fresh apple pie and whispered that she was sorry about the situation, but her husband wouldn't let her sign any formal complaints. They were afraid of retaliation from the bikers. The situation got worse when the troublemakers discovered Harold's daily walk to Betty's diner. They started following him on their motorcycles, riding slowly beside him as he walked, making comments about his age and his careful steps. Betty offered to start delivering his breakfast, but Harold refused. The day I can't walk to get my own breakfast is the day I might as well give up, he told her firmly. One evening, as Harold sat in his study looking at his old military photographs, he heard the sound of glass breaking. Running to his front window as fast as his old legs could carry him, he saw several beer bottles shattered among his rose bushes. The troublemakers were speeding away on their motorcycles, their laughter echoing down the street. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. He sat in his favorite armchair, the one that still smelled faintly of Martha's perfume, and stared at his wall of military memories. His eyes fixed on a particular photograph, one from his days as a tactical officer, where he had led a complex operation that required more brains than brawn. Something stirred in his mind, a familiar feeling from his military days. The sensation of gears turning, of pieces falling into place. Harold had faced worse situations in the war, and he had always found a way through them, not with force, but with strategy. As the sound of motorcycles continued outside, Harold Thompson, decorated veteran and tactical expert, began to form a plan. The bikers thought they were dealing with a helpless old man, but they were about to learn that age and experience could be more powerful than youth and intimidation. That night, as Harold sat in his study, surrounded by memories of his military service, something changed inside him. The yellow light from his old desk lamp fell across the medals displayed on his wall, making them shine like beacons from the past. His silver star, earned for strategic brilliance rather than brute force, seemed to wink at him in the dim light. He pulled open his desk drawer and took out a worn leather folder, his old military planning kit that he hadn't touched in decades. Inside were blank tactical planning sheets, still crisp despite their age. Harold ran his fingers over the paper, remembering how he used to fill these pages with detailed operation plans that saved countless lives during the war. You're thinking about this all wrong, old man, he muttered to himself, a habit he'd picked up since Martha passed. You've been acting like a victim when you should be thinking like a tactician. Harold reached for his reading glasses and a fresh sheet of paper. His hands, though wrinkled with age, were steady as he began to write. He titled the page Operation Iron Peace, a name that made him smile slightly. Just like in his military days, giving the mission a name made it feel real. As midnight approached, the sound of motorcycles still rumbled outside, but Harold barely noticed them now. He was deep in thought, his military-trained mind working like it hadn't in years. On his desk, he spread out old photographs from his tactical command days, reminding himself of operations where he had turned seemingly impossible situations into victories. The first rule of tactical planning, he spoke softly, reciting from memory, is to know your opponent better than they know themselves. He thought about the bikers, particularly the troublemakers. They saw him as just a weak old man, and that was their first mistake. In war, Underestimating your opponent often led to defeat. Harold pulled out another sheet of paper and began drawing a detailed map of Oak Street. He marked the bikers' usual parking spots, their gathering times, and the routes they took. His trained eye noticed patterns they probably didn't even realize they had, like how the snake-tattooed leader always parked under the old oak tree for shade, or how they held their main meetings every Wednesday evening. As he worked, memories of his most successful military operation flooded back. It had been in 1945, when his unit was vastly outnumbered by enemy forces. Instead of engaging in direct conflict, Harold had devised a plan that turned the enemy's own routines against them. They had achieved their objective without firing a single shot. The best victory, he remembered his old commander saying, is the one where your opponent doesn't even realize they've been defeated until it's already done. Harold stood up and walked to his bedroom window, looking out at the quiet street now. The clubhouse was still lit up, shadows moving behind its windows. He noticed something he hadn't paid attention to before. Many of the motorcycles parked outside had veteran service stickers on them. This detail made him pause, adding a new dimension to his planning. Returning to his desk, Harold pulled out his old military intelligence handbook. The pages were yellow with age, but the wisdom inside was timeless. He flipped to a chapter titled Understanding Your Environment and began reading, nodding as familiar concepts came back to him. Every situation has hidden advantages, he read aloud, if you know where to look for them. Harold glanced at a photograph of his unit from the war, young men standing proud in their uniforms. They had faced impossible odds too, but strategic thinking had always found a way. As the first light of dawn began to creep into his study, Harold had filled several pages with notes and diagrams. His plan was taking shape, but it wasn't like anything the neighbors might expect. There would be no confrontations, no legal battles, and no running away. Instead, he would use something far more powerful, psychology and strategy. Harold Thompson, the old veteran they thought was helpless, was about to show them why he had been one of the military's most successful tactical planners. His age wasn't a weakness, it was his greatest strength. Because while the bikers had youth and noise on their side, he had something far more valuable: experience, patience, and a lifetime of strategic wisdom. The next 7 days showed a side of Harold Thompson that Oak Street hadn't seen before. While his neighbors still saw the same old man tending his roses and walking to the diner, they didn't notice how his eyes had become sharper, more observant. He had transformed his front porch into what he secretly called his observation post, complete with his comfortable rocking chair and a small notebook hidden under the morning newspaper. Every morning, Harold would sit there with his coffee, appearing to do nothing more than enjoy the early sunshine. But his military-trained eyes were constantly moving, watching, and analyzing. He noted how the bikers arrived in specific patterns. The younger ones usually showed up first, around 10 a.m., while the older members came later in their cars, looking more serious and businesslike. In his notebook, Harold drew detailed maps and time charts. Monday, 10:15 a.m., Snake Tattoo arrives with 2 others. Parks under oak tree. Leather vest has road captain patch. His handwriting was neat and precise, just as it had been during his war days when every detail could matter. One particular detail caught his attention on the 3rd day. As he watched through his reading glasses, he noticed that several of the bikers who arrived in cars had military bumper stickers. Desert Storm Veteran, read one. Afghanistan Vet, declared another. Harold carefully counted at least 7 different veterans among the club members, though none from his era. The most interesting discovery came on Thursday morning. Harold was pretending to doze in his rocking chair when he overheard a conversation between 2 of the older bikers. They were standing near his rose garden, unaware that his hearing aid was working perfectly fine. "These young guys are giving us a bad name," said one, a gray-haired man with a Marine Corps tattoo on his arm. "This isn't what the club was supposed to be about." "I know," replied his friend, wearing a faded Desert Storm cap. "But they're good riders, and we need the numbers to keep the club going. Just wish they'd show more respect, especially to the old-timer across the street. My grandfather was in World War II, too." Harold kept his eyes closed, but his mind was racing. This was valuable intelligence. There was a divide between the older and younger members. In his military days, such internal conflicts had often been the key to successful operations. Later that afternoon, Harold made his way to Betty's diner for his usual late lunch, but today he had an additional purpose. Betty, who had known him for 20 years, noticed something different about him as she poured his coffee. "You're looking better today, Mr. Thompson," she said, not as worried. Harold smiled. "Betty, dear, do any of the bikers come here to eat?" Betty nodded, lowering her voice. "The older ones do, usually for breakfast. They're actually pretty decent customers, always polite. It's those young troublemakers that give them all a bad name." This confirmed what Harold had observed. He spent the rest of his lunch making notes about which bikers came to Betty's, what they ordered, and when they usually arrived. In his tactical planning days, knowing an opponent's routines had often been the key to success. Back home, Harold organized all his gathered information. His study wall now featured a detailed chart showing the club's hierarchy, based on the patches he'd observed on their vests. He had identified 23 regular members, including the troublemakers who had been harassing him. More importantly, he had identified 12 veterans among them, including several in leadership positions. As evening fell, Harold sat in his study reviewing his week's worth of observations. The picture was becoming clear. This wasn't just a group of troublemakers, but rather a complex organization with its own internal dynamics and conflicts. Just like the difficult situations he had faced in the war, the solution wouldn't come from confrontation, but from understanding and carefully applied pressure at the right points. "The best weapon," Harold murmured, remembering his old commander's words, "is the one between your ears." He looked at his wall of notes and smiled. The bikers thought they were dealing with a helpless old man, but they had no idea they were being studied by one of the military's most meticulous tactical minds. Phase 1 of Operation Iron Peace was complete. He had his intelligence. Now it was time to plan his approach. Early Sunday morning, before any of the bikers usually arrived, Harold put his plan into action. His neighbors watched in confusion as he carefully hung a large, hand-painted sign on his front fence. In neat, bold letters it read, "Veterans Welcome. Coffee and donuts on the porch. 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. Below that, he added in smaller letters, "World War II veteran would love to share war stories." Next, Harold brought out his old military footlocker from the attic. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it for the first time in decades. Inside were his carefully preserved uniforms, medals, and photographs. He arranged these items on a folding table on his porch, creating a small display that told the story of his service. His silver star gleamed in the morning sun, positioned next to a photograph of his young self receiving it. Mrs. Anderson from next door hurried over, concern written all over her face. "Harold, are you sure about this?" she whispered, glancing nervously at the motorcycle club's building. "Aren't these the same people who've been causing you trouble?" Harold just smiled and continued setting up folding chairs on his porch. "Sometimes, Martha," he said, using his late wife's first name as he often did with close friends. "The best way to disarm an enemy is to invite them for coffee." He didn't tell her that this strategy had once helped him turn a hostile village into a valuable ally during the war. At precisely 9 a.m., Harold set out 3 boxes of fresh donuts from Betty's diner and a large thermos of coffee. He had specifically asked Betty for her strongest brew, remembering from his observations that the bikers who came to her diner always ordered extra strong coffee. The first hour passed quietly. A few regular morning dog walkers passed by, looking curiously at the setup. Harold sat patiently in his rocking chair, seeming to doze but actually watching the clubhouse through nearly closed eyes. His military training had taught him that patience was often the most powerful weapon. Around 10:15 a.m., exactly when Harold had predicted based on his observations, motorcycles began arriving at the clubhouse. He could see them noticing his sign, some pointing and laughing. The troublemakers, led by their snake-tattooed leader, seemed particularly amused. But then something happened that the younger bikers didn't expect. One of the older members, the gray-haired Marine veteran Harold had observed earlier that week, stopped his motorcycle in front of Harold's house. He stared at the military display for a long moment, particularly at a battle flag Harold had carefully positioned in the center. "Is that the 5th Marine Division flag?" the biker called out, walking toward the porch. Harold opened his eyes fully and smiled. "Indeed it is, served with them in 45. Would you care for some coffee?" The Marine veteran, whose vest identified him as Sarge, hesitated for just a moment before climbing the porch steps. His eyes were fixed on Harold's silver star. "Sir, you don't earn one of those for just showing up," he said respectfully. "Pull up a chair, son, Harold replied, pouring coffee into a clean mug. Have you ever heard about the Battle of Iwo Jima from someone who was there? As Sarge sat down, clearly interested, Harold noticed more veterans from the club starting to gather around his fence. Just as his intelligence had suggested, nearly half of the older members had military backgrounds. Even some of the younger bikers were drifting closer, trying to appear uninterested but clearly listening. The troublemakers watched from across the street, their usual bravado diminishing as they saw Sarge, one of the most respected members of the club, sitting and talking with the old man they'd been harassing. Harold pretended not to notice them, focusing instead on sharing his stories with an increasingly attentive audience. His plan was working perfectly. In his military days, Harold had learned that true strength often came not from confrontation, but from finding common ground with your opponents. As he poured another cup of coffee for Sarge, you could already see the dynamics shifting. The first phase of Operation Iron Peace was unfolding exactly as he had planned, not with force or threats, but with donuts, coffee, and shared experiences of brotherhood. Over the next few days, Harold's porch became an unexpected gathering spot for the veteran bikers. Word had spread quickly through the club about the old World War II veteran and his remarkable stories. What started as a simple coffee and donuts invitation had turned into something much more meaningful. Sarge, the gray-haired Marine veteran, had become a regular visitor. He would arrive early each morning, helping Harold set up the chairs and brewing fresh coffee before the others arrived. The two men had discovered they shared more than just military service. They both had a passion for military history and tactical planning. You know, Sarge said one morning, looking slightly embarrassed, I feel terrible about how some of our younger members have been treating you. We're supposed to be a brotherhood of riders, not bullies. Harold nodded wisely, pouring Sarge another cup of coffee. In the war, I learned that young men often act tough because they're trying to prove something. The real challenge is helping them find better ways to prove themselves. The transformation was happening exactly as Harold had planned. Each day, more veteran bikers would stop by, drawn in by the stories and the sense of camaraderie. They brought their own military photographs and medals to share, creating an impromptu museum of service history on Harold's porch. Even the troublemakers couldn't ignore the change. The snake-tattooed leader, whose name Harold had learned was Jake, would watch from across the street, his usual swagger diminishing as he saw how the older members treated Harold with growing respect. The turning point came on a Wednesday afternoon. Harold was showing Sarge and a few other veteran bikers a tactical map from Iwo Jima when Jake's motorcycle suddenly made a horrible sputtering noise and died right in front of Harold's house. The young biker tried to restart it several times, but nothing worked. Without hesitation, Harold stood up from his rocking chair. In my garage, he called out to Jake, I have some tools that might help. I used to work on military vehicles during the war. Jake looked up, surprised and suspicious. The other bikers watched, curious to see what would happen. After a moment of obvious internal struggle, Jake's pride gave way to practicality, and he wheeled his bike into Harold's driveway. As Harold led Jake to his garage, he could hear whispers among the veteran bikers. They all knew this was a significant moment. Inside the garage, Harold turned on the light to reveal a meticulously organized workspace with tools arranged military-style on pegboards. My father was a mechanic for Harley-Davidson, Harold said casually as he began examining Jake's bike. He taught me everything he knew before I joined the service. Back then, keeping vehicles running could mean the difference between life and death. Jake watched in amazement as Harold's old but skilled hands quickly diagnosed the problem, a loose ignition wire and a clogged fuel filter. As they worked together to fix it, Harold shared stories about maintaining vehicles under enemy fire during the war. Jake, despite himself, found that he was genuinely interested. You know, Jake said after they had finished, wiping grease from his hands, we all thought you were just some grumpy old man who wanted to ruin our fun, but you're actually pretty cool. Harold smiled, remembering his own youth. Sometimes the best way to have fun is to learn from those who've been around longer than you have. Why don't you join us for coffee tomorrow morning? I got some stories about motorcycle missions during the war that might interest you. To everyone's surprise, Jake showed up the next morning, bringing a few of his younger friends with him. They sat somewhat awkwardly at first, but soon found themselves drawn into Harold's tales of military motorcycle scouts and dangerous night missions. The neighborhood watched in amazement as the dynamic continued to shift. The same young men who had once terrorized Harold now helped him carry chairs out to the porch each morning. The loud motorcycles still came and went, but now their riders would wave respectfully to Harold as they passed. Harold's strategic plan had worked better than even he had hoped. By appealing to their shared experiences and offering friendship instead of confrontation, he had transformed potential enemies into allies. The war veteran had won another victory, not with weapons or threats, but with wisdom, patience, and understanding. 1 month after Harold's first coughing morning, Oak Street had transformed into something nobody could have predicted. The Iron Knights Motorcycle Club's monthly meeting was in full swing, but this time it was happening in an unusual location, Harold's backyard. The old veteran sat in his favorite chair, surrounded by both young and old bikers, sharing his tactical expertise with an attentive audience. In combat, Harold explained, pointing to a map spread out on a folding table, successful missions depend on careful planning and teamwork. The same principles apply to organizing your charity rides and community events. The club members leaned in, fascinated by how Harold's military strategies could improve their own activities. Jake, the former troublemaker with the snake tattoo, sat closest to Harold, taking notes in a small notebook. The young biker who had once led the harassment campaign was now one of Harold's most dedicated students. After Harold had helped fix his motorcycle, Jake had discovered that the old veteran knew more about bikes than anyone else in the club, thanks to his wartime experience with military motorcycles. "Mr. Thompson," Jake said, raising his hand like a schoolboy, "could you tell us more about how you coordinated those convoy missions? We're planning a big group ride next month, and I think your experience could help us make it safer." The other bikers nodded in agreement. Harold's military knowledge had already helped them improve their formation riding and communication systems. The club's safety record had improved significantly since they started following his suggestions. Sarge, who had become Harold's closest friend in the club, smiled proudly. Earlier that day, he had presented Harold with a special gift, a custom-made leather vest with the Iron Knights logo and a unique patch that read Honorary Road Captain, Strategic Advisor. The vest now hung carefully on a hook near Harold's military uniforms. "You know what amazes me?" Sarge said to the group, "A month ago, we thought we were just dealing with a grumpy old neighbor. Turns out, we had a tactical genius living right across the street." The bikers all laughed, still a bit embarrassed about their earlier behavior. The transformation went beyond just meetings and motorcycle advice. The younger members who had once littered Harold's garden now helped him tend to his roses every Sunday morning. They had even built a special rack near his porch where visiting bikers could hang their helmets while enjoying coffee and conversation. Mrs. Anderson, Harold's worried neighbor, could hardly believe her eyes when she saw the troublemakers, now reformed, carefully pruning Harold's rose bushes under his direction. "You're cutting at a 45-degree angle," Harold would instruct, "just like I learned to do precision work in the service." The club's reputation in the community had also changed dramatically. Instead of being seen as a nuisance, they were becoming known for their community service, much of it inspired by Harold's stories of military humanitarian missions. The Iron Knights now organized regular charity rides, and Harold helped plan each one with the same attention to detail he had once used for military operations. One evening, as the sun set over Oak Street, Betty from the diner stopped by to deliver Harold's dinner. She found him sitting on his porch, surrounded by young bikers who were listening intently as he explained the importance of proper motorcycle maintenance using lessons from his wartime experience. "Who would have thought," Betty whispered to Sarge, who was helping her carry the food, "that the solution to all that trouble would be coffee and war stories?" Sarge watched as Jake demonstrated to the other young riders the proper way to check their bikes, using the inspection routine Harold had taught him. "It's more than that, Betty," he replied. "Harold didn't just stop the trouble, he turned us into something better. He showed us what real leadership looks like." The street was quieter these days, not because the motorcycles were gone, but because their riders had learned to respect their surroundings. The Iron Knights still held their meetings and gatherings, but now they were purposeful events, organized with the precision Harold had taught them. The old veteran looked around at his unlikely new family, leather-clad bikers of all ages who had become as dear to him as his own military unit had been. In all his years of tactical planning, this might have been his greatest victory, turning potential enemies into loyal friends and creating a brotherhood that bridged the generations. 6 months after Operation Iron Peace began, Harold sat in his usual spot on the porch, watching the sunrise over a very different Oak Street. The morning air was filled with the gentle purring of well-maintained motorcycles as early riders headed out for their morning rides, each one giving a respectful nod to the old veteran as they passed. Today was special. The Iron Knights were holding their first annual Veterans Appreciation Day, an event that Harold had helped plan with his usual military precision. His front yard had been transformed into an outdoor museum of military history, with members of the club bringing their own service memorabilia to display alongside his World War II artifacts. "Everything's ready for the ceremony, Mr. Thompson," Jake called out as he finished setting up the last display case. The young biker who had once been Harold's biggest problem was now one of his most devoted friends. Jake had even started taking night classes in military history at the local community college, inspired by Harold's stories. The neighborhood had changed too. Mrs. Anderson, who had once been too afraid to leave her house when the bikers were around, now ran a coffee stand at their events. Betty's Diner had become the official meeting spot for the club's weekly breakfast rides, with a special table permanently reserved for their honorary road captain. As the morning progressed, visitors began arriving from all over the city. Veterans from different eras came to share their stories, drawn by word of mouth about the remarkable 93-year-old tactical officer who had transformed a troubled motorcycle club into a community asset. The Iron Knights provided escort rides for elderly veterans who couldn't drive themselves to the event. "You know what's amazing?" Sarge said to Harold as they watched the crowds gather. "6 months ago, we were just a bunch of bikers making noise. Now look at us. We're running veteran support groups, organizing charity rides, and teaching motorcycle safety courses to young riders." Harold smiled, remembering the night he had first formulated his strategy. "In war, I learned that the greatest victories often come from turning enemies into allies," he said. "But I never expected to make such good friends in the process." The highlight of the day came when the club's president, a Vietnam veteran named Mike, called everyone to attention. Standing in front of Harold's rose garden, which now featured small plaques honoring fallen veterans among the blooms, he made a special announcement. "Thanks to Harold's guidance, we've raised enough money through our charity rides to start a scholarship fund," Mike announced. "The Iron Knights Veterans Education Program will help veterans and their children attend college. And we're naming it after our inspiration, the Harold Thompson Strategic Leadership Scholarship." Tears welled up in Harold's eyes as the crowd applauded. Jake stepped forward, holding a leather-bound book. "We've also collected all your tactical lessons and military stories into this manual," he said proudly. "Every new club member will receive a copy, so your wisdom will guide generations of Iron Knights to come." The transformation of Oak Street had become a local legend. Other motorcycle clubs from around the state would visit to learn how the Iron Knights had built such strong community ties. Harold's porch became known as a place where riders could always find wise advice, good coffee, and stories that bridged the generations. As the sun set on the successful event, Harold sat in his rocking chair, surrounded by his unlikely family of bikers. The street was quiet, not because of any rules or restrictions, but because of mutual respect and understanding. Young riders still came to the club, but now they found mentorship instead of mischief, purpose instead of chaos. Looking at his military photographs on display next to the modern-day veterans' memorabilia, Harold felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His strategic mind had won many battles during the war, but this peaceful victory on Oak Street might have been his finest achievement. He had not only solved his own problem, but had helped create something valuable for the whole community. "Martha would have loved this," he whispered to himself, touching the wedding ring he still wore. "She always said that the best way to defeat an enemy is to make them your friend." As if in agreement, a group of motorcycles rumbled past, their riders raising their hands in a respectful salute to the old veteran who had taught them that wisdom and understanding were stronger than fear and intimidation.